um, about the less restrictive standards and policies and the dealing with hospital policies and particularly restraints. So I had a case in Colorado where a nurse was working the night shift, and she was actually in an area that served one of our major prisons. So she had a Department of Corrections patient that was, as we would say, crashing. The patient was having a lot of problems with his blood pressure. It was a post-op medical nurse, med-surg unit. She hears some kind of commotion, and one of the other nurses comes up to her and says, you know, your patient in this room is trying to get out of bed. Call your doctor and get an order for restraints and Haldol. So she does, and she charts. So this is a multi-level issue here, issues. She charts that she called the physician, that he gave her an order for Haldol, but she didn't chart the restraints. So they'd already placed the patient in restraints. So that was at 1 o'clock in the morning. The patient was kept in restraints through the night, and she never charted that she gave the Haldol, which she did, but she charted in the medical record that she'd gotten the order for, and the Pyxis machine shows that she withdrew it. So we've got documentation that the medication was given. The policies of the hospital say if you have a patient that's in restraints, you have to chart every 2 hours the status of the patient. And now that many facilities, this one included, are moving to EMR, electronic medical records, as soon as you hit the button that says restraints, all of a sudden you get this drop-down box, and you get all these options that you got to fill in. You know, did you check circulation? You know, are they loose? And you know, patients still need restraints. The patient was an elderly man, who had sundowners, which means at night, during the evening, they get very disoriented, very combative, and he was a post-surgical patient. Okay, so my client's going in and out through the night, doesn't chart it, all right? EMR record doesn't reflect that the patient's in restraints. Day shift comes on. They don't chart that he's in restraints. And apparently the patient's wife comes in about 9 o'clock and says, why is my husband in restraints? So the day nurse goes in and takes restraints off. Okay, no harm, no foul, that's the end of the story. That was in August. In September, you, as the hospital administrator, get a letter from the patient. You know, I was in the Korean War, and I still have PTSD. And when I was in these restraints, I started getting flashbacks that I'm still getting. So immediately, you, as the administrator, say, give me this patient's file. Get the patient's file. I don't see any restraints here. Never charted. So they call a nurse in. They call both nurses in, because remember, my nurse was responsible for the patient. She didn't put him on. They called both nurses in. Both nurses say, well, you know, I was just really busy, it was a really bad night. Okay, that's fine. Both get fired. Now, obviously, you did that proactively, because what do you think's coming next?
Lawsuit.
Exactly, a lawsuit. So, client contacts me because she's terminated. Hospital notifies the Board of Nursing. Hospital notifies the Board of Nursing on both nurses. Board of Nursing dismisses the case against the other nurse. No action on her record. Hospital hires her back. Board says, no, we're not going to dismiss it because you were the primary nurse. So we go through the evidentiary stage of preparing for a formal hearing. What we find out from our nursing expert, and I had reviewed the records and started seeing this, was in these EMRs and in the case that you mentioned where the patient's head got stuck and she died because the side rails were up, in this institution, 4 side rails up equals restraints. We were able to go through that chart during that man's hospitalization and see that there were 11 instances where the patient had 4 side rails up. And not once did anybody chart that he was in restraints. But by hospital policy, it was a situation where the little drop-down box should have come down and they should have been charting that they were checking on him every 2 hours. So, their expert didn't know about that until I took her deposition. And I just started looking the pages. I was like, oh, I didn't know about that. I didn't know about that. I didn't know about that either. Within a week, the Board of Nursing's attorney filed a motion to suppress all of that information. And 2 months ago, the judge ruled and said, yep, you're right, it's not relevant. It's not relevant at all that the patient was in restraints all these other times. We're only concerned about this one shift for 5 hours when your nurse didn't chart. Case goes away. Client, what's the point? We already know that we're going to lose this case in front of the judge. So what's the point for you? You know, the point is that you suggested that you've got to know what your policies are in your hospital. And you've got to know that they're being followed. Now, what you do beyond that point, of course, is up to you as administrators or working for administrators. But I think it's incumbent upon you to understand that these gory stories that we're hearing, you know, are attributable to, ultimately, when you're working as a nurse in a hospital, to the hospital. And while it says the nurses are held personally liable, the issue of master-servant or respondeat superior means that the nurse really isn't personally liable. It's you as an administrator. It's the hospital that ultimately will be liable for any negligence that any of your staff perform or do on patients.